Welcome to another episode of Things You Didn't Know About the Holocaust. I'm Phyllis Dimbler Miller, and I have with me today a guest who is very special because what she does is study genocide in a way to educate others. She's a doctor and she's a public historian, but she's going to tell us first how at the age of 10 she got into this.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. I'm quite excited about our conversation. Um, so when I was very young, I lived near a Holocaust survivor, Helen Sperling, and she was constantly giving talks at schools. And she came into my fifth grade class, and she had just this powerful way of telling stories to any age. And she told her story, and it included cupcakes and birthdays and best friends. And it didn't erase the sadness of her story, but it made it incredibly relatable to someone who was 10. Um, so much so I could remember it. And I can tell you much of fifth grade I don't remember. And so moving forward, I went into college. I had continued to read Holocaust diaries and memoirs as kind of more of a teenager. And I went to sign up for a Holocaust history class. And my real motive was that we were going to take a trip to Germany and Poland at the end of the semester, and I really wanted to go. But I was able to invite Helen back to the college to give a presentation, and it was a packed room. And I was sitting in the front, and she was so incredibly powerful because she was able to cater that storytelling to an older audience then. So I heard this different perspective that while, the main part of the story was still the same, the way she presented it just moved you to tears. You were laughing one a minute, you're crying, you're serious. Um, and she had that influence on everyone in that room. And so I was able to talk to her afterward while I was bringing her home. And she said, continue the journey, learn as many stories as you can. There are so many stories, you'll never be able to learn them, all of them, but try. And I really accepted that challenge and wanted to continue learning, primarily because of her and that, mission of wanting to bear witness for her.
What is a public historian?
So it depends. There's a lot of different branches. So from my perspective and my experience, I've worked in many different museums, which is public facing. And so when we create curriculum or we just make displays, we want it to be accessible to everybody. We want to be mindful of age, what's age appropriateness, what's inclusive, language. We don't want to be over complicated with jargon. Or if we are, we want to explain what that looks like. What does it mean? Provide the historical content and context. So for me, it's not just simply something that's academic, for example. I'm not just sitting in a classroom with university students who may already have all that information. It's being mindful of going out and maybe telling someone for the first time what the Holocaust is, in a way that's accessible.
And what is the Holocaust to you? In other words, is it something that's so horrible that we can't even grasp it, or is it something that is very human based? If that makes sense.
So I think it might be both. I think there's an impossibility of understanding it in its totality because it is so grand that we can't grasp. I mean, numbers alone we can't grasp. I mean, how do we understand 6 million? We can't. Um, we can understand conceptually that it's a large number, but I think just because there is that larger aspect to it, that it doesn't make it not individual stories, that it doesn't make it human, that we have to be mindful that it is human. Because to me, the Holocaust is something that is still present in many ways. And understanding that while yes, it's a historical event, it still is in its, you have survivors, you have intergenerational survivors, you have people who are impacted with what happened. Um, and so to understand that really helps understand how you can prevent it from happening again. Taking that information and seeing it not just as a historical event, but something that has impact now. And how do we take that information and protect people? Um, how do we apply it to other groups of people to help other people understand who are the other, and how do you prevent people from being othering? So to me, it's both something you can't fully understand, but also understand that it comes from humans and what humans are capable of. Um, and while being mindful of that and understanding how do we take that information and prevent it from happening again.
So how are you preventing it from happening again?
So for me personally, I believe in education as a wonderful foundation. Um, and so that can look like, having little kids learn about what it is to include somebody in a conversation, whether they're playing and maybe they aren't including somebody. And while it's certainly not a historical example, you're teaching them that there's importance to understanding someone else and empathy and bringing them in and saying, hey, this kid probably wants to play with you too. Let's do that. And as they get older, you can add that kind of layer of history and explaining what the Holocaust is, what genocide is, um, and really showing the impact that you can have as being a good person or you can have as being a bad person. So to me, education is really the root of starting to prevent and starting to teach people that what you say matters, what you do matters, and really instilling that understanding and going beyond tolerance. I think tolerance is often something we talk about, and to me, it's a good start. Um, but I think educating beyond that and saying, don't just put up with somebody, invite them in, understand them, have conversations. I think oftentimes we're scared of other people we don't know because they are different, and we don't even give them an opportunity to talk with you to understand where those differences are, and see how great those differences can be. So for me, my way of preventing is by education.
I'm thinking of how education here in California is being used the opposite way.
Hmm,
That I don't know if you know about the liberated, that's in quotes, ethnic studies curriculum and how anti-Semitism, Jews as oppressor,
hmm,
has been taught in schools here in California for several years. So, okay, I'm not going to go into the whole politics, but what really, really bothers me is that I just read in a Jewish publication that, well, if so and so law passes, then parents in California can have a chance, the option to send their kids to private schools. And all I could think about is, do
hmm,
you understand what you've just said?
hmm.
You are allowing anti, and by the way, it's going to be probably mandated to graduate high school in California. Uh, Knowing anti-Semitic literature. Not, we're not talking Israel. We're just talking teaching hate
Hmm.
to an impressionable young people. I mean, I'm beside myself.
Well,
You're talking to me at a bad time because I'm really emotional about this.
understandably,
I just can't understand using education to teach hate.
right? I mean, unfortunately, there's such a history of that, and it's been very challenging to see the shift in education, I think throughout the United States, really, of what's permissible. Um, and of course, some students are probably aware of what they're learning and may not agree, but if you don't have any background knowledge, you might just be learning and taking this information in and not being aware of the implications of what you're learning. And so you're molding these minds to think a certain way, and yet it's alarming because those, unfortunately, what they're going to learn is going to last, and it's hard to unlearn. It's very hard
Yeah.
to unlearn things. Yeah.
And Jews, yeah, here on the coast and here on the other coast, you know, there's a large population, but I grew up in Elgin, Illinois, and where I was often the only Jewish kid in my classes. And those people have no opportunity to learn the opposite.
Right.
So what they know, and I can see them easily being turned. I mean, I'll never forget. a boy in ninth grade turned to me in geometry class. Okay, this is how much, well, I remember he did not know I was Jewish. And not that I hid it, he just wasn't a, friend of mine. He said, "Do you know why Jews have big noses?" I said, "No." He said, "The air is free." Do you know that I didn't even know what that meant?
Wow. Yeah.
No. This is in the 50s. No, by this time it was 60 something. So I said, "I'm Jewish." He went, "Oh," or something. I mean, so lots of times they're just repeating what they've heard,
Right.
but what they've heard leads them into thinking ways of how can we kill someone today? No, no.
But it, it unfortunately is just, can spiral. And I would say certainly not everyone's going to get to that extreme, but you can easily get to that extreme, unfortunately, especially when there are other factors that are prominent that can push you to thinking that it's okay. And so you have, kids are particularly impressionable. They're learning, they're engaging. And I mean, your example is great because he probably hasn't engaged with a Jewish community before, so he hasn't actually interacted with a person. But clearly has heard this and has no problem repeating it. And so if you're
In
able
class.
to, right, right, in a setting that it's certainly not appropriate, um, and then just to not have an opportunity then to actually meet a bigger Jewish community. And then in turn, you can just continue to hate or be fearful, and be influenced because you're not able to engage and see the good side, really get to know people as they are. Um, yeah, so for me, that just goes to the root of the education needs, that unfortunately are not always met.
So in your work, what are you doing at the moment?
So I'm currently teaching, actually. I teach anthropology and I also teach humanities classes, um, at a couple different places, but in person, I teach at Ithaca College, where I teach a cultural anthropology class. And actually, this coming week, we're going to be talking about genocides that are currently happening and what that process is, what happens in the world that lets these things happen. And I found that my students, we started talking about it yesterday, actually, and a lot of my students were really surprised that there are genocides currently happening. Um, and really just unaware of what's happening. And sometimes I'm almost envious of that. I wish I could be unaware of that. Um, and so we're going to really talk about that and look at, what kind of roles can we have? What voice do you have? Um, Maybe not globally, but even at home, what kind of influence can you have? I think a lot of my students, particularly right now, feel very voiceless and a little bit lost as to how they can make an impact in the world, whatever that may be. So we want to kind of look at what they can do. So we're gonna have that conversation tomorrow. So hopefully, hopefully it goes well and we get some at least a start of a conversation.
I think that's very interesting what you say about how important language is, even
Mhm.
in the home.
Yeah.
And what people say in jokes can be really harmful
Hmm.
in terms of, uh, I can't think of any examples except the one I just gave you, but I'm just thinking about okay, I'll give you an example because this is from a Jewish point of view. I mean, a very close friend of mine. So we had a conversation uh, a year and a half ago, 2.5 years ago, in a group, and we were talking about anti-Semitism. And my friend said, "I think it's a compliment that people say Jews are good at business."
Hmm.
And I said, "No, it's not. First of all, there are many, many poor Jews. Many, many, many. So let's forget it. Okay.
Mhm.
But the point is, that is a stereotype that is then used to uh, for anti-Semitism.
Mhm.
So, whereas she thought it was a compliment till we discussed it, she now sees that that is not a compliment. And I
Yeah.
think that Jews themselves tend not to see what they say in the world can have long lasting impacts. Oh, I'm not blaming the Jews, by the way. I'm saying,
I mean, it's hard when, and I think this is true for any sort of stereotyping, when you frame it in a positive way, it is very challenging sometimes to accept that what the positive thing they're saying actually has some really negative connotations. And it's such an ingenious way to insult somebody or bring down a group of people because then they can defend themselves and say, well, I'm saying something nice. But in reality, when you think about what that means and what the larger impacts are, what they're saying actually has some really negative impacts. So yeah, I mean it's really quite smart way of approaching it, unfortunately. And a lot of people, if they don't understand where the root of that, like for example, the business perspective comes from, they won't understand that it's anti-Semitic and what does it actually mean. I went to a conference just to give an example, oh gosh, about 5 years ago. Um, and it was about Jewish perspectives on many things. And I listened to someone give a talk about the different roles that the Jewish community has in the United States. It started off very strong. It was very interesting. Um, and then he went into the idea that Jews control Hollywood. And I just sat there and I sort of froze and I thought, oh, where are we going with this? And he kind of went on and he was talking about how Jews run the media and all these anti-Semitic statements. But he was not to excuse what he was saying, he was a younger student. It was very much, I think, rooted in 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 goodness. But he probably had done research and found those statements online and just used them, not knowing that they were actually anti-Semitic. And so I was listening and I kept thinking, how do you approach explaining to him that, Jews running the media is anti-Semitic? And he was giving examples, of the Jewish community in Hollywood, for example. And yes, the actors he was referencing were Jewish, but he didn't understand what it meant if the Jews ran Hollywood or if the Jews ran the media. He just saw it as something nice. He unfortunately had a lot of backlash that he couldn't he couldn't work through. I think there was a better way of approaching him. But during the Q&A, he was certainly torn apart for his statements, which I feel like he learned a little bit, but at the same time, this is where that trauma-informed lens comes from. I think had someone sat down with him one-on-one and talked to him and said, let's talk about anti-Semitism and the things you're saying and explain to him, you know, I know you don't mean this in a negative way, because he didn't. If you listen to the rest of his presentation, it was a very nice, representation of different communities. And he just kind of lost his way a little bit. And so I think had someone actually sat down with him and helped him and talked to him and show him historical examples of what this means and why people say these things, he could have learned. But instead, he was very ostracized at this particular conference for saying that. And I don't know where he is now. I'll have to look him up. Um, but it was just such a moment, an educational moment that wasn't approached very well.
it was
But
a very much missed opportunity.
yes, 100%. And I think about that often when I think about what am I presenting, what am I saying, who am I representing? Just be mindful of that because yeah, I think he meant well. He just didn't know. So learning experience for sure.
Yes, and Hitler used those tropes very, very successfully in terms
Right.
of Jews being money grubbing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and controlling the media. I mean, all lies, but they had been taught from an early age that that was true, and so therefore, I mean, this is a little bit off the subject, but just to show you, my husband and I were stationed in Munich, Germany, from with the U.S. Army from September 70 to May 72. And at one point, I had a job at the Army Air Force Motion Picture Service with a woman who at the time had been a teenager, night school, crystal knock, spontaneous. She'd been sent, and she'd been sent home early for the spontaneous event. She was not a just average German woman. And I said to her, Miss Winkler, why did you go to war? Only 20 years after. I mean, she said, well, Hitler said we needed more living space, and that made sense.
Mhm.
And I go over that and over that sometimes because I've just came across it somewhere else. That made sense. Yeah. Where?
Mhm.
Where were they going to take land
Right.
and just get rid of the people, I guess? I mean, they did, but
Right. I think it's that critical thinking and education part. I mean, you know, if you're taught to critically think about what someone says, then you might take it to the next level and say, how? Where are we going to go? Where can we possibly expand Germany where there aren't already people? Um, but if you think about it at face value, you're like, yeah, it's nice, let's have more land. But if you're not educated to think critically or think, how could that happen? Or question, um, and have conversations, you might not think too much on that question and just say, oh, he's probably got it covered. He's a leader. We're gonna follow him, and he's probably got a plan. Then, that's how you're educating and training people to think. And I'm not saying that's how all Germans thought, but
no, no, no.
certainly
Right.
need need to understand and critically think about things.
In terms of critical thinking, does not mean that we think that everything that Jews do, uh, everything is not correct. We have we have to we have to own up to when we are not doing things correctly.
Yeah.
But I think that we also have to understand, okay, this is the way the world runs. The world sees Jews as X, and we have to educate them to see us as Y.
Hmm.
And not why, but
Right, right.
why. And that takes, I mean, I think of another example. So before we got to Munich, we were at Fort Knox for my husband went on active duty for Armor Officers Basic. And we had to share a car. I mean, my husband offered because we each had one car and we were living off base with a couple from the South. And they said to us, we've never met a Jew before. And when I told this woman that we didn't have Christmas, I spent 9 weeks with her, by the way. Uh, she just couldn't understand it. She
Hmm.
said, but it's Christian. I don't know what she said. I said, no, no, you don't understand. Jews don't ex
Right.
un understand, don't accept Christ. I didn't, no, I wasn't that harsh. It's we don't celebrate Christmas. We don't celebrate Christmas. And she just couldn't get over it.
Yeah.
And her husband had a master's in parasitology. So go figure.
To
Oh, no,
throw off.
wait, it's better. I
Oh,
was reading while 6 million died at the officer's pool next to her.
uh-huh.
And this is in 1970, summer of 1970. And her husband said, you don't have to believe that.
Oh,
Oh,
yeah.
I don't know whether he was trying to protect her or he
Uh,
didn't believe it. It's just like crazy.
It, I mean, a couple things come to mind when you say that, but just the idea that you don't have to believe it, but you've also never met a Jew before. So, what is the harm in believing? Not that you should have a choice of believing or not. I don't think that's an actual choice. But if that's his argument, why is it hard to believe that something like this happened? It has no, you know, harm in believing it. There's a lot to unpack there. Um, eh, wow.
Yeah.
Now, did she follow up and want to talk about it, or was she just left it and didn't want to acknowledge?
It's a long time ago. I
No,
don't,
okay.
I don't remember. I mean, I just remember lying on the beach towel or whatever, reading it, and she said, and he said I didn't have to believe it. Uh,
Mm.
so it just in that moment struck me so strongly that I think it probably pushed everything else out of
Right,
my memory.
right. Mm. I,
So, I mean, today when you see people say, I just saw something somewhere, no one could kill 6 million Jews like it's an impossible physical feat. Oh, well, eh, the work I'm doing now with the things you didn't know about the Holocaust, it's all over the place. I mean, 6 million is very, very, very easy to kill. But I think that the concept of, say, in this case, I don't understand whether I don't know whether that person really could not grasp 6 million
right,
or just thought it was impossible. Am I
right.
making sense?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, that's what I mean, like when in regard to having so much to unpack, because I guess the question could be, is it that, like you said, like you can't believe that it's 6 million because that's very hard to grasp? Or is it that he denies that the Holocaust happened because of anti-Semitism? Or um, is it, you know, I don't know, there's so many different routes you could go to have that response. All of them very problematic, but just it'd be interesting to see if you asked him about other genocides, for example, would he have that same response? Because then you'd know if it's anti-Semitic or if it's a numbers thing or if it's, a lack of education. Because, it's depending on how he approaches it, could really speak to his beliefs about Judaism and Jews. And if he says, well, the Holocaust doesn't happen, but I can accept this other genocide, then I would say it's probably anti-Semitism.
Right.
So, yeah.
That's that's very interesting, and a thought just went on in my head. So, punt, Phyllis. So many things are going around in my head at this moment. One of them was that I attended Holocaust Museum LA 2 weeks ago, had this event of the Armenian and the Holocaust speakers from both in a panel. And the Armenians, they're still waiting for Turkey to say Turkey committed the genocide. Whereas, at least in, for example, Germany has now accepted its role. It did when we were living there, it was like,
Mhm.
no, but now it does. And I think that part of coming to terms with it is this guilt of what would you have done? What would you have done had you been in that place? Would you have turned in your neighbor? God, I hope not. But if it meant the difference between your family being at risk or and the other, I don't know.
You know, when I first started studying the Holocaust, I had convinced myself that I was going to be this great person and I would have hid somebody or I would have, protected somebody. And as I've gotten older, I've realized how easy it is to say that. Um, and I have a 2-year-old and I look at her now and I think, I don't think I would save somebody if it meant something happening to you. Um, And while I hope that isn't the case, and while I say, there were certainly parents who protected other people during the Holocaust, despite having, or maybe in honor of having their own kids, a part of me tries to convince myself that maybe I would protect someone else to teach my child that you should protect someone. But the really rational part of me says, yeah, but if it threatens my kid, am I willing to take that risk? So as a single person, I think it's just me. If it's just me getting that backlash, that's one thing. But now that I have a child, it's such a different experience to really have to think about what that means. And a lot of people, really judge people for turning people in. And I'm not saying that that wasn't a terrible thing to do, but really understanding the human part of it and what does that mean for their family, their children? Were they being threatened? I think sometimes we like to simplify history and not really try to understand the human perspective of it. And of course, there were people doing it because they were anti-Semitic. I'm not talking about those people. Um, but just really understanding that we can't fully grasp what that means. There's a reason why they're considered righteous. It's because it's such a hard choice to make and such a threat to your life that you did that. And so to understand that kind of layered experience, I don't think a lot of people can do. I know myself, I can't fully do. We want to hope we're good people though. And I tell myself that as I read stories that, maybe I could be this person, but maybe not. Um, and I know even in like during like little actions during the day, I try to be mindful of like if someone drops something, am I going to go out of my way to help them pick that up? I'm going to try. Um, just those little actions to try to help create that foundation and teach my child you can help people. And obviously, there's no threat there to me doing those things, but it has to start somewhere. And we need to teach that there are ways to help people and they might not really influence you too much, but they can make that person's day or they can really help them in a way you don't know. And so that's the philosophy I always try to stay with is maybe I couldn't do this grand gesture, but let's do at least the little daily things that we can do that maybe will have an influence. And those are the things that I know I can do. And hopefully I will never be asked to do something so grand, but do what I can do.
I just want to explain to my audience who might not have understood Sarah's reference when she said righteous. She's talking about righteous among the nation, which is non-Jews recognized by Yad Vashem. There's a whole controversy or whatever about whether Jews who saved other Jews, but they are recognized by B'nai B'rith. But to be recognized as a righteous among the nation, there has to be a lot of proof.
Yes. Yeah.
And and I was just looking up someone, and it said recognized by Yad Vashem in 2015, but he died in like 1980 something. And so, uh, without probably even knowing, and I mean, there were lots of people who didn't even tell their families that they were, well, you might want to not want to tell your children you risked their lives to save someone, or it might be in your nature not to even think of it that way.
Right. Right. I mean, if you are the type of person who's willing to take that risk on, um, I think there's a few things. One, a lot of people I've spoken to who did risk their lives or saw someone else risking their lives, they don't want to talk about it because they still have this innate fear that if someone finds out what they did, they could be punished because that was kind of the climate then, and it's hard to get rid of that feeling. Um, So there's that perspective, but also, like you said, if they're doing this act, they're not thinking necessarily in that moment, how am I going to be recognized in the future for the thing I do? They're doing it to do a good thing, or maybe not even to do a good thing. Maybe they're not thinking about it that way. Um, Maybe they're just doing it because they know somebody and they want to protect their neighbor, or maybe it's a friend, or maybe they're even getting paid. And you know what? In that moment, they're still taking that risk on. And there's something to be said for taking that risk on, even if they're getting paid, they still have to feed the people that are with them, or there's so many layers to that. Um, so yeah, I mean, the amount of posthumous awards that have gone out, it's wonderful and sad at the same time that they're not seeing their recognition, but at least they are being recognized, and then their families can have that and be very proud of what their families have done.
You just said something I thought was very interesting. I don't think that Yad Vashem recognizes people who were paid to hide
I think
Jews.
you're right. I think you're right.
And
Yeah.
yet they took as much of a risk as anyone else.
Yeah. Yeah.
And maybe more so because they might have been in places where those acts were not encouraged, and therefore they were taking even a bigger risk. I mean, I'm making this up on the fly, but the truth is that I never ever judge either. I just don't judge people who went through the Holocaust and whatever that means to you. Whether I count a Holocaust survivor as anyone who
Mhm.
fled before he or she had to. I mean, if you left Germany in 33, you were a Holocaust survivor because
Mhm.
you were forced to give up your life. So, okay, I realize I'm going on a little bit. It's my philosophical conversation, but I do think that we can't judge, nor could we even judge at the moment, because you never know everything. So I read a lot of those diaries and memoirs, etc., that you
Yeah.
that that you read, and you know, I just don't know. You know, I've been wanting to tell this story for the longest time. A very Orthodox person told me that her her grandfather, uh, was in a village way before the Holocaust. Well, I don't know how far. And he heard that a Jew was in prison over Shabbat. He said, no, no, he can't stay over Shabbat in prison. He just has, I'm going to go get him. You know, it's before Shabbat, bring him home. And okay, he should have Shabbat with us. I don't know how many years later, my friend's father was in a camp close to death. And this man said, I owe my host a life. And he was a cop. I mean, he was a something rather. And he said, save this man. I mean, I'm not telling you exactly right, but I've never forgotten that ever, ever, ever because of what it represents in terms of human goodness.
Yeah. Those I think it speaks to the idea of daily doing something daily that's good and helping somebody else can really have an impact on you later in life as well. Um, but I mean, what a profound experience though. And I bet, that person probably didn't rethink, think about having that person come to Shabbat. I bet they did it and it was done and they probably moved on with their life and probably
Right.
didn't think about it too often.
But
Um,
this, on the other side, he remembered
mhm, yeah,
and 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 paid it back.
right.
Yeah. So I just saying you never know. Not that you should go around and do things so that you can get paid back, but right? Okay,
Yeah.
good, good. But Sarah, this has just been a delightful, delightful philosophical conversation. Do you have anything that you'd like to add in terms of uh, whatever on the topic?
Oh. Um, I think that I really hope your listeners um, go out and read either a diary or a memoir of a survivor, whoever that might be, because I think you made a really great point that survivors are not just a certain group of people. It is many different groups of people who had very different experiences. And I know that in my research and my conversations with survivors or academics or students, they have this idea that you either had to be in a camp or you had to be in a ghetto to be a survivor. And it's so unfortunate because with that, we lose so many stories. We're missing, the refugee who came over in 1933. And you're right, they left behind their home, their life, their families, their language, I mean, all of it. And that's a big experience that impacts you in ways you forever. Um, and so I think going out there and reading beyond what's the typical Holocaust memoir or diary is really great because it can show you just how impactful it was and how complicated it was and how many different experiences there really were.
I'm just gonna end with well, one thing is I never say about Auschwitz, for example, 1 million or something. I always say 6 million because I don't want to give Holocaust deniers the opportunity to say, oh, and it was only 1 million there, and you're okay, because there are people who think it's only Auschwitz. And then I was just having a conversation at synagogue with this daughter of I don't know, how many generations ago. And I said, and I saw in your mother's house the Schranks. Now, I don't know if you know that German word, Schrank.
Yeah.
So they got out in time to ship their furniture. And so it's pretty early.
Yeah.
But that furniture represented to them a home in a way that so many survivors afterwards never had anything. And I can't, because we lived in Germany, I know what Schranks look like. These heavy pieces of furniture, and yet they had memory. And I
Yeah.
think that that's so interesting to talk about what did it mean to be displaced? I mean, I'm doing research now on, not research like you, but research on displaced persons after the war, and I'm
Hmm.
horrified by what I've read.
Yeah.
But and the inability of Jews in America to understand after the war what Jewish survivors
Hmm.
needed
Yeah.
from separate than they needed in terms of trauma.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's true even today. Like I had this amazing conversation with two Australian women who worked in a nursing home that was specifically for survivors. And it was inclusive to all sorts of survivors, but there was a very large population of Holocaust survivors that were at this nursing home. And they were talking about how they're specifically trained to work with Holocaust survivors because for so long, a lot of people didn't know how to interact with survivors, but particularly now, a lot of their patients either have dementia or Alzheimer's or a whole lot of memory issues. And so a lot of them are regressing back into that time period of their experiences during the Holocaust. And so they're either afraid of showering. A lot of times they had therapy dogs come in and now they know they can't have therapy dogs. How do they adjust their day-to-day operations to not re-traumatize or continue traumatizing survivors because they want to understand, how do we help them and how do we make them comfortable too? Because this is their new home. And oftentimes just being in a new place like a nursing home is has its set of challenges as well. But then to add on that layer of survival and that history. So they were talking about all those different steps they were implementing to try to help survivors kind of acclimate to this space. And one of the things they did mention was this idea of bringing artifacts from home and like making it as homey as possible, um, so that they felt like this was their space. So it just made me think of that experience.
Uh, yeah, and it's reminding me of something else, but I don't. It's something that okay. So bottom line, took kids to it's okay. It's too confusing. I'll just skip to the part in which Elgin High School kids that I was with because of a project of mine saw a blanket in uh, the museum, the Chicago Holocaust Museum. And that was the thing that when they were questioned later, I mean, I know you're not exactly following because I'm not explaining, but in front of 200 teachers, impromptu, that was what they talked about. And that blanket that the little girl her father had made from a burlap sack when they were hiding, and she gave it to the museum with the caveat that she'd get to come and visit it every so often, that they would take it out. And that hit them in a way that I think and they weren't Jewish, by the way. None of them were. Um, just the way it hit you at the age of 10. They were 17 or 18, but those little things can make and can humanize
Yeah, right.
the other.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so we're gonna pass out teddy bears. No, no, I'm just
Right. Yeah. Um, I don't know. I mean, I'll briefly give you this information, but um, so I volunteered at Auschwitz-Birkenau for when I was doing my master's program. and I was in the conservation department and I worked with a lot of different artifacts. And just the idea that these artifacts are people and they have stories and memories, and it really might be the only connection still with the tangible world that exists is such a profound concept to me. Um, and typically I say that and I start to tear up, so I'm surprised I'm not now. But just this idea that, how impactful it is to have that burlap sack for her, for example, and what that meant to her and that connection probably to her dad still. I I can't understand that fully. Um, and I'm very happy that I can understand that. But I've heard that so many times that, I have this one thing, and this one thing is so incredibly important. And it might seem like the most insignificant thing to an outsider. Because I mean, when you think about like a burlap sack, what are we doing with it? We're gonna throw it out when we're done with it. Um, and so just to think about how meaningful certain things are to certain people because of that connection to someone else is so impactful to me.
And I like the idea very much that these nurses at Jewish, well, retirement home, old age home, are really conscious of these kinds of things.
Yeah, yeah. I I want to say, I mean, I was surprised in a lot of ways. I hadn't thought about it in terms of what that meant um, in a nursing home setting. And, how do you get someone to, for example, bathe in a way that they're comfortable with, where you're not essentially threatening them? They feel like they're threatened when you say you need to take a shower. So how do you kind of adjust? How do you adjust to, not closing shades or, curtains at night when it's still too bright, like different things like that. I mean, just there's so much there to unpack. I'm hoping they wrote something. I've never actually looked. I just think about that experience a lot. But yeah, it's amazing. And I'm glad there are people out there that are doing that work and are, like you said, very mindful of what their experiences were.
And I'm glad there are people like you doing the kind of work that you're doing. So I want to thank you, Sarah. This has been a really, I would say, philosophical conversation, but very, very interesting. I want to thank my listeners. And as I end every one of these particular podcasts, I say, may the memories of the victims and those who tried to save them be a blessing forever.